Hello, and welcome to today's episode of the LaRouche Organization's Manhattan Project for April 30th. The process that we find ourselves in today as we meet was characterized by the poet Percy Shelley in a poem called England in 1819. He said, "An old, mad, blind, despised, and dying king, princes, the dregs of their dull race, who flow through public scorn mud from a muddy spring, rulers who neither see nor feel nor know, but leech-like to their fainting country cling till they drop, blind in blood without a blow. Religion, Christless, godless, a book sealed. A Senate, time's worst statute, unrepealed, are graves from which a glorious phantom may burst to illumine our tempestuous day." The problem as to whether or not the world is going to survive the process of a kind of kamikaze global Britain, an Anglosphere, including the United States, emphatically, which is hurtling toward a kind of appointment in Samara, as it used to be called, a kind of nuclear Samara, a rendezvous with doom, not merely destiny, is a great concern to all of humanity. At the same time, in order to know what might be done to actually change this course, you have to first of all know the events, but you have to have also a notion of an alternative. What we're going to do today is present three presentations. The first by Harley Schlanger, the second, which is by video, of course, of the late Lyndon LaRouche, and then we have Mike Robinson of UK Column. And we're going to try on the basis of this to give you, the listener and participant, a way of thinking of how you can, as an individual, and in conjunction with others, do something about this most dire circumstance, because we believe that we are not only not powerless, but we may have the greatest power that exists on the planet to stop these events. So we'll go first to Harley Schlanger. Harley, good to see you.
Hi, Dennis. Good to be with you. Start by making a simple point, which is that there's no way to understand the events that are occurring around Ukraine and around the total war being conducted against Russia from the Western media, from official reports, from the talking points that are being put out there. If you live in the transatlantic world, you live under a totally controlled media narrative bubble, an information war in which the truth is, as they often say, the first casualty of war. Let me just give you a couple of examples to start with. Lloyd Austin, who we identify as the defense secretary from Raytheon, in his speech at Ramstein Air Base, where they finally broke down the German opposition to going whole hog into the war against Russia, Austin was bragging that, quote, Ukraine won the Battle of Kiev, unquote. Well, there never was a Battle of Kiev. The Russians never intended to take Kiev. The idea that this was a great victory shows the extent to which they're spinning reality. And anyone who lives in Ukraine and is now watching the Ukrainian army being chewed up in the Donbass knows that if that was a victory, another victory like that and the country's gone. He also talked about Russian aggression with no mention of the 20-year efforts by the Russians to resolve the problem of Ukraine being used as a weapon against them. Nor was there any mention of the 14,000 casualties, many of which are Russian ethnic civilians in the Donbass, killed by Ukrainian military forces, including neo-Nazi brigades. So Austin was on a complete pep rally approach with lies and this is now part of the narrative. Now, there are also constantly attempts to rebut Putin, by saying that what Putin is doing is attacking Ukrainian democracy. Well, the opposition parties in Ukraine are being shut down. The leading opposition figure, Alexander Medvedchuk, is in prison. He's been arrested. His party has been taken down. There are numerous radio and television and newspapers that have been shut down. This is a democracy. They also talk about the defense of sovereignty, that we're defending the sovereignty of Ukraine. Well, where was that defense in February 2014 when the regime change coup was conducted, funded by $5 billion, at least $5 billion admitted, coming from the US Department of State, admitted by the would-be controller of Ukraine, Victoria Nuland. Now, what we have stated from the beginning, the LaRouche Organization, the Schiller Institute, is that there are two opposing policy directions which are in a confrontation right now in this situation. This situation in Ukraine is a symptom of these bigger policy fights. This is a battle that's been shaped over the last 2 centuries. And it's essentially a battle between an American system idea of sovereign nation states committed to the economic development of their population versus an empire, a British empire, which takes care of the richest private interests at the expense of the rest of the world and treats as much of the world as it can as a colony, in recent years making the United States a co-partner in imposing this imperial dictatorship. Now, that's what the unipolar order is. And the people of Ukraine are not the victim of the Russians. They're the victims of the Western unipolar unilateralists who are using Ukraine as a battering ram to destroy Russia. Now, the reality is that as this battle is deepening, we're seeing a very clear realignment emerging, which is what Helga Zepp-LaRouche was talking about as she initiated the call to convene a conference to establish a new security and financial architecture. That as the old system, the unipolar order, is collapsing, crumbling under the weight of uncollectible, unpayable debt, destroying the physical basis for sustaining a population. While that's going on, there is prosperity developing in the East, in Asia, centered around the Belt and Road Initiative of China, but not exclusively in China. And there are countries all over the world that in the last century emerged from colonialism only to be put under a new form of colonialism from the International Monetary Fund, the London and Wall Street banks. They're now emerging, demanding the sovereign rights to act in the interests of their people. That's the fight we're seeing right now. And the reaction from the transatlantic forces is to go for what they call the Great Reset, which is essentially to not only take away sovereignty from nations, but take away sovereignty from people. Take away the power of elected representatives to make budgets and determine where credit should go, and leave that entirely in the hands of central bankers. We've called this a global central banker dictatorship, but that's really just part of it. The central banks themselves are largely owned by the largest private banks, institutions like BlackRock and Vanguard. They're the ones who demand the right to dictate policy. This is where we see the actual dictatorship of the unilateral or unipolar order. Now, while this is occurring, it was enforced by a policy going back to especially 2001, but it goes back a little bit more than that, but a policy of regime change, that any nation which resisted the control and the power of these banks would be subjected to color revolutions, regime change, beginning with the Balkans, with Afghanistan, with Iraq, with Libya, with Syria. The smaller, weaker nations, to the extent that they tried to fight for an alternative, were targeted with lies and targeted militarily with destruction, leaders overthrown and murdered, to the cackling approval of people such as Hillary Clinton. Now, after 2017, after December 2017, this regime change was no longer targeting only smaller countries. The targets now included the so-called great power competition, what was called the revisionist powers of Russia and China. And this was in a document called the U.S. National Security Strategy document of 2017. So the idea was to apply these principles of regime change even to the most powerful nations in the world, should they try to get in the way of the unipolar interests of London and Wall Street. Now, the question has become increasingly, can the transatlantic powers impose their unilateral demands on Russia and China? And this broke out into the open, especially after February 4th of this year, when Presidents Putin and Xi met and signed a declaration which included a whole series of economic measures for cooperation and development. Now, this brings into question, what is the real fight? What is really behind the choice of Ukraine? What is really behind the moves toward US building an Asian NATO, the British calling for a global role for NATO? And I want to begin by just giving you a sense of realignment through the eyes of London, through The Economist magazine, which in its April 22nd issue had an article with the title is "What's at Stake in Ukraine?" And what they essentially talked about is they did something which was relatively honest for dishonest reasons. They did a breakdown of the population, the numbers of people who live in countries that are for the war against Russia, those who are neutral or abstain, and those who are against it. And they said that essentially 1/3 of the world's population lives in countries that are supporting the US-British attack on Russia. 1/3 of the world's population live in countries which are neutral, such as India, Indonesia, South Africa, and others. And 1/3 of the population of the world lives in countries which they claim echo Russia's rationale for the invasion of Ukraine. They describe this as part of the, quote, emerging world, unquote, former colonies. And they say the citizens in these countries see the West primarily as, quote, decadent, self-serving, and hypocritical, unquote, which I think is actually an accurate assessment of at least the policies that are being conducted by the transatlantic governments. Now, The Economist described this alignment as a, quote, stunning rebuke of the West, implying that the West is losing the information war. They write that, quote, rulers of other countries worry that if the West is free to act as judge, jury, and executioner, they will get summary judgment. In other words, sovereignty taken away from them and put under this banker's dictatorship. They say this reaction is, quote, a poisonous cocktail of legitimate grievances and exaggeration, all laced with lingering resentment of colonialism. Now, as far as it goes, that's accurate. Of course, they say this is a phony picture because the real battle is between democracies and autocracies, as the case was made fraudulently by Boris Johnson and others in last December's so-called Summit for Democracy. But what's the real underlying fight here? I want to read you a quote from a man named George Friedman, who now is the CEO of something called Geopolitical Futures. But this is a quote from 2015 when he was the CEO of Stratfor, a leading strategic analysis firm that is completely funded by the so-called military-industrial complex. In a speech at the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations, here's what he said. The primordial interest of the United States, over which for centuries we have fought wars, the First, the Second, and the Cold Wars, has been the relationship between Germany and Russia, because united there, they're the only force that could threaten us, and to make sure that that doesn't happen, unquote. Now, in this, he was stating one of the principles of Halford Mackinder's 1904 document, which became the basis of what is properly called geopolitics. The idea that a combination of Europe and Eurasia as an economic force would overwhelm the power of the British Empire. That's what Mackinder said. And Friedman was updating it to say the British-American, the Anglo-American Empire, could not tolerate an economic alliance of Germany and Russia. Because if you put together German technology and German finance with Russian raw materials and labor force, it would become the predominant power in the world. Now, of course, that's thinking in geopolitical terms. It leaves out the possibility that such an alliance would be based on a cooperation between nations that could then link up with what Xi Jinping calls the win-win policy of the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, let's take a look at a little bit more of where Friedman's concerns come in. Of course, we just saw well, let's take the most blatant. The Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom, Liz Truss, who someone is obviously telling her she could be the next Margaret Thatcher. She spoke at the London Lord Mayor's Easter banquet on April 27th. And the topic of her speech was titled, "The Return to Geopolitics." And she's not talking about geopolitics as a generic term as it's tossed around by many commentators today. She's talking about Mackinder's idea of geopolitics, what was expressly there in Friedman's concept. And she said that the intention of Britain is to reboot, recast, and remodel the current international security and economic architecture. Now, she's explicitly doing this as a counter to what the Schiller Institute did with our April 9th conference. Because Helga Zepp-LaRouche said the key issue now is to convene a conference to establish a new security and economic financial architecture. Now, Liz Truss is saying, yes, that is the issue, but we're going to do it as global Britain. We're going to do it as global NATO. And she went on to say that we now need a new approach because the existing approach through the United Nations and G20 doesn't work because they include Russia. So she said, we need a new approach, one that melds hard security and economic security, one that recognizes that geopolitics is back. And she concluded this section of her remarks by saying, the war in Ukraine is our war. Ukraine's victory is a strategic imperative. That we have to ramp up production of weapons, tanks, and airplanes, but we need to go further, she said. This has to be a catalyst for a wider change. We must also apply this tough stance to the threats that are emerging beyond Ukraine, that is, China and Asia. Now, when you hear that explicit statement from Truss, you then have to look at what happened at the Ramstein Air Base, where there was a war council presided over by the defense secretary from Raytheon, who talked about providing more weapons, more heavy weapons, so that Russia's military can be weakened. Now, leading into this, there was a refrain going around Europe that Germany's not a reliable ally. Germany's not in. Germany's resisting the imperative of taking on Russia. Well, this was broken down at this Ramstein event. And afterwards, the German government, or during the event, the German government promised to provide tanks that have anti-missile or anti-aircraft missile capability and more heavy weapons. This was then ratified by the Bundestag several days later by a 400 to 100 vote. In other words, Germany is rearming as part of this geopolitical war. Now, there's more coming from the British. I think we've reported on this. You've probably heard this. James Heapy who is the Armed Forces Minister of the United Kingdom, stated that it's completely legitimate for Ukraine to use weapons from the United Kingdom to strike targets inside Russia. You have Tobias Ellwood, who's the chairman of the Special Defense Committee of the Parliament, who's an ally of Boris Johnson and the Tory party, who said that the United Kingdom must be the, quote, vanguard, unquote, leading a, quote, coalition of the willing, unquote. I mean, this is a little tone deaf, isn't it? The coalition of the willing was the Bush-Cheney slogan for the forces that went into the war in Iraq based on completely false pretenses. He's calling for a coalition of the willing against Russia, explicitly for an intervention in the Black Sea against the Russian fleet. Now, you look at those comments, and you have to see that what's shaping up is what's now really quite evident. As Ukraine is being demilitarized, as its army is being destroyed, the West is pumping in more and more weapons. Some people say this is a defense of the military-industrial complex money-making. Well, that's part of it. But it's an attempt to keep the war going, to destroy Russia, because of the fear that what came out of that February 4th meeting between Putin and Xi, and what's emerged since then, in reaction to the sanction policy and the efforts to destroy Russia economically, that what's emerging since then is the beginnings of a new financial system, which had its origins long before this Ukraine situation. In fact, the origins of this idea go back to Lyndon LaRouche with his proposals in the 1970s for a European monetary fund, for Lyndon and Helga Zepp-LaRouche's proposals for a European economic triangle at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union, for Helga Zepp-LaRouche's consistent, persistent efforts to establish the idea of what became known as the Belt and Road Initiative after 2013. Helga had been proposing this as the Eurasian land bridge, as a basis of a new financial system based on physical economy, American system production, development of new platforms of infrastructure. And this has now become the outlook of what's approaching a majority of nations around the world. That's what the Ukraine war is about. The West trying to destroy Russia, destroy a Russia-China alliance, and to communicate to countries such as South Africa, India, Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, your only future is with the Anglo-American financial global dictatorship. Now, I want to conclude this by letting you know what Vladimir Putin had to say in response to this escalation of especially British, but also the German influence, what Austin is saying about weakening Russia, Biden's personal attacks against Putin, but more importantly about the efforts to create a military counterpole to what Russia's trying to do to make Ukraine a neutral country. Putin gave a speech on April 27th, the same day as Truss's speech to the Lord Mayor's Conference. He spoke to the Council of Lawmakers, and here's how he ended his speech. I would also like to note something I spoke about at the beginning of the special military operation. Let me emphasize it once again. If anyone intends to intervene from the outside and create a strategic threat to Russia that is unacceptable to us, they should know that our retaliatory strikes will be lightning fast. We have the tools we need for this, the likes of which no one else can claim at this point. We will not just brag, we will use them if necessary. And I want everyone to know this. We have made all the decisions on this matter. Now, the bluff and bluster of a narrative could come head to head with the new weapons capabilities in Russia. This is not because of Russia's intention to launch aggressive warfare. It's not an attempt to reconstitute the Soviet Empire, the foolish line that you hear from so-called Western analysts. Russia is doing this to defend the gains they've made since 2000, after the attempt to dismantle and destroy Russia during the Yeltsin years. And what Putin is committed to is not just avoiding another period of the 1990 to 1998 degeneration, but of the destruction of the Nazi invasion during World War II, during which between 27 and 30 million Russians died as the Soviet Union took the brunt of the Nazi attack. And what Putin is saying is they're not going to allow this to happen again, once again coming through Ukraine by Ukrainian frontline forces that trace their roots back to the Ukrainians who joined the Nazis at that time of destruction and genocide against the people of Ukraine, because that's who is targeted by the Galician SS. So Putin is essentially saying, don't push us. Now, I wonder if Liz Truss hears that. I wonder if Biden hears it. The question that we have to ask ourselves is, how can we make clear not just that we're speaking for Putin, because we're not. We're speaking for the idea that people have a right to sovereign nations that develop their populations for the benefit of all mankind. And that what we're fighting is this neoliberal, green global dictatorship. This is what's threatened by the nations in revolt in the realignment that's underway. But it needs a program to replace this Malthusian genocidal plan. And that's what the Schiller Institute has developed. And I hope we'll have a chance to discuss that a little bit more during the further discussion on the program today.
Thank you, Harley. What we want to do is to talk a bit about the problem that has occurred with the confusion, clearly as you see it in the State Department of Washington as well as in the presidential administration, on the question of what constitutes American interests. As the attorney Bruce Fine pointed out, at the point that you begin to argue that the Solomon Islands are crucial to the strategic interests of the United States, and therefore you have to have a globally extended NATO to protect them, you know you've gone pretty far afield. The artist Thomas Cole was actually born in England, but is considered an American artist and the founder of the Hudson River School. Did a series of 5 paintings that were commissioned by a man by the name of Luman Reed. They were called The Course of Empire. And what Cole was doing was trying to warn the United States of exactly the sort of thing that John Quincy Adams had spoken about America not going abroad seeking monsters to destroy. Cole wrote a short text in which he described the purpose of his paintings, which were done between the years 1833 and 1836. And he said this, he said, "A series of pictures might be painted that should illustrate the history of a natural scene as well as to be an epitome of man, showing the natural changes of a landscape and those effected by man in his progress, from barbarism to civilization to luxury to the vicious state or the state of destruction and to the state of ruin and desolation." This is the series of paintings. He said about these, "The philosophy of my subject is drawn from the history of the past, wherein we see how nations have risen from the savage state to that of power and glory, and then fallen and become extinct." The poet Lord Byron considered that to be an inevitable process. He said in his poem Childe Harold, "There is the moral of all human tales. 'Tis but the same rehearsal of the past. First freedom, and then glory. When that fails, wealth, vice, corruption, barbarism at last. and history with all her volumes vast hath but one page. That was not, no, I don't want that, thank you. That was not the outlook of Shelley. Shelley, as we indicated before, we don't have to show this, but just to refer to it, he thought that the kings, the rulers, the princes, the senates were graves from which a glorious phantom may burst to illumine our tempestuous day. He thought there was not a necessity, not an inevitability at all for people to necessarily embark upon that kind of design of ruin. Now, people like the novelist Gore Vidal believed that America was an empire. It had become an empire, and it had had certain kinds of ideals, perhaps at the beginning, but they had always been tainted, and that even at the point that you had Lincoln's Revolution, after the American Revolution, sometimes referred to incorrectly as the Civil War, that process of establishing the American nation state, while very positive, at the same time became the basis for an imperial America after Lincoln. And you'll hear many, many people in the United States say this. We do not say this. We say something different about the nature of the problem of America. And to indicate what we believe the nature of the problem is, I want to have Lyndon LaRouche, the late Lyndon LaRouche, the economist and statesman who founded this organization, say something to you about his view of the true problem of America, starting from, in particular, the time of the death of Franklin Roosevelt.
But this is a part of the degeneration of our morals. And we're coming to a very difficult time. Look at the comparison. April 12, 1945, Roosevelt died. Now, I'm not going to praise Roosevelt up and down, but Roosevelt was a president, and he was a real president, unlike some other things we've had since. That is, he was concerned about the outcome of the war, not just fighting the war. He was concerned about the outcome of the war and the kind of world that represented for the world at large and for the United States. Both the United States as a nation and the United States as an idea. And his big opponent on this issue was Sir Winston Churchill, or Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Prime Minister Winston Churchill was one of the more evil men of this century. Behind the list there lurked a real butcher. Now, Roosevelt died, and Churchill had some accomplices in this country. He had Stimson, a real swine. He had a fanatic, Jimmy Burns. And Stimson had a stooge, a young stooge there by the name of George Bundy. And this crowd around Harriman succeeded in making that poorly prepared, shall we say, intellectually and otherwise poorly prepared Harry Truman into nothing but a stooge for Winston Churchill. And as a result of that stooge coming into power, a totally unnecessary act occurred. There's no military justification for it, and I know the facts. Some people are persuaded of the other, but they don't have any facts to back it up. There was no reason to drop those 2 atomic bombs on Japan. None at all. No military reason whatsoever. It was done to inaugurate the nuclear age. And I said, well, kill a bunch of Japs, what difference does that make? We're going to inaugurate the nuclear age. We only had 2 bombs. We had 3, but we tested one at Los Alamos. That left 2. 1 uranium bomb and 1 plutonium bomb. Little boy and fat boy. And we dropped them both on Japan. And then we had no more bombs. But we inaugurated, under Winston Churchill's order, and the order of Bertrand Russell, we inaugurated the nuclear age. What we did is we created, where Roosevelt tried to prevent that, we created a world in which the nuclear conflict between Moscow and the West shaped world politics up until 1989. We lived through an unnecessary nuclear age, an unnecessary balance of power. Roosevelt knew what the problem with Stalin was. He had no illusions about that. But Roosevelt had a conception of how to use American power in the post-war world to engage in destroying the vestiges of colonialism. All the countries that were under colonial rule of the Dutch, the French, and the British were supposed to be freed at the end of the war. When Roosevelt died, that was reversed. And the Dutch and the British and the French took back their colonies under order. So therefore, the great reservoir of goodwill, which lay waiting for us in countries which have been colonial, in giving them their freedom and opportunity for development, that was taken away by Harry Truman. Not by Harry. Poor Harry didn't have the brains to know what he was doing. But by Harry the Stooge. And we got into a period of folly. Then came along 1960, and my generation came into power, as typified by President Kennedy, a man of a new generation, my generation. And there came a brief spell of the Kennedy period, which included the success of the first phase of civil rights struggle. Civil rights wasn't invented then, it had been around for hundreds of years. But my generation, the returning veterans of World War II, had, despite all their faults, they had within them an understanding of this problem, and the Kennedy administration typified the fact that the American people were ready to respond, at least to that degree, to this appeal. And they did. But very soon it turned the other way. As a matter of fact, since Martin Luther King was killed, the whole thing has gone the other way, gone down all the way. There's been no improvement in the condition of life of minorities in this country on the average since that time. It's gone downhill. And since we are becoming a poorer nation, those who are poor are generally, as a group, poorer on the average than they were 25 years ago. They give them opportunities for education. Well, what kind of an education? The education collapses faster than you can have affirmative action, safe affirmative action, right? The quality of education is worthless. Now we have another president, Clinton. Like Roosevelt, like Kennedy, he's hated by the British, or shall we say the Anglo-Dutch oligarchy. He comes from the generation of '68, the generation of the baby boomers. He signals the coming into power in this government of the baby boomers. Who is in government? Who are the key people occupying more and more of the positions of authority in corporate America, in institutions, and in government? The baby boomers. The people of the president's generation. And this group of people are more poorly educated, more poorly qualified culturally than my generation, more poorly qualified by far than Roosevelt's generation, knowing less history, less background, less drive for science. As in the 20th century, the civilization been collapsing. But we have a president who, as things go, is good, better than the visible alternatives generally, who has done some good things, though sometimes we think not enough of them. We still represent, despite all our decay, the most powerful nation on this planet. If something is going to happen to get the world out of the mess in which it's in now, it's going to have to come in large part from the United States. It's not going to come from the Republican majority in the Congress, is it? It's not going to come from the news media, is it? It's going to have to come from leadership. And the only leader in sight with power, whatever you think of him, is this guy who's president. And what's immediate around him. So therefore, obviously, if you're going to affect the history of mankind so that your grandchildren's existence means something more than a guess, and a bad guess at that, then you're going to have to influence this process to ensure that the United States government, among other institutions on this planet, does within the next 18 to 24 months what it must do, at a minimum, to ensure civilization's survival of this great crisis through which we're going. Now let me review this same thing from a different standpoint, from a more technical standpoint. Now, some people may say this is heavy, as a gentleman down in Tuskegee said a week or so ago, but These are heavy times. And light ideas don't do any good. You've got to face the heavy ideas. Now, what's a heavy idea? You can't weigh it by the pound. What makes it heavy? Very simple. We go into life, we wander around the streets, and you meet a jerk coming down the street, and you know this guy's an average jerk, and you think you're obliged for some reason or other to strike up a conversation with friend jerk, or neighbor jerk, as the case may be, or brother jerk. So now, knowing what jerks are, you know how the jerk's mind works. And therefore, you know what he believes, you know what his prejudices are, you've read the polls, you remember? You know what the popular movies are, you know what the popular television shows are, you know what the popular books are, you know what popular opinions are up and down the street by different classes of people, you know what their prejudices are. I mean the nasty ones, not just the ordinary prejudices, but the really nasty, dirty ones. You know which ones this guy's probably carrying a load of. And so you want to strike up a conversation with Brother Jerk. Well, if you want to discuss something beyond the weather, you know what the safe subjects are, don't you? And if you want to stick to those safe subjects and those safe assumptions, you can walk away after the conversation, having shaken hands. Well, nice to meet you. Nice to know a man who thinks like I do. Right? And you go away and say, I think like him? What's wrong with me? Huh? Okay, that's light thinking. Nothing heavy about it. You want to get heavy, you say to the guy, well, what are we going to do to clean up racism in America? That gets heavy. All right, so what heavy conversation and heavy ideas are those which involve challenging axiomatic assumptions. Axiomatic in the sense of the axioms of geometry, most of which are false, by the way. The point is an infinitesimal smallness, the line is a straight line, all this sort of thing. Remember? It's all fake. None of it's true. Anyway, but that's all right. So, but something which, from the standpoint of evidence, enables you to show somebody what you mean by the falseness of a generally accepted idea, and the presenting of conceptions which are contrary to popular opinion, either of people in general, or a class of races, or a class of university professors. It doesn't make any difference. Everyone's got their own prejudices, their own shtick, as they say. So if you're going to say something important these days, when all of the ideas which are generally accepted are leading us to disaster, then you're going to have to say something pretty heavy. And if you haven't said something heavy, you haven't said anything worth saying. Because what you have to do is you have to convince people that, and show them that not as Socrates did in the famous Socratic dialogues. You raise a proposition. The guy says, well, everybody agrees that this is the case. You say, but everybody's wrong. If too many people believe in something, you know it has to be wrong. So let's examine this assumption. Let's ask ourselves, what is it that people assume which causes them to believe this proposition? Now, is what they assume true? Let's examine that. And let's go deeper. And let's discuss what that means. So a Socratic dialogue which challenges the axiomatic assumptions of deeply held belief of people is what is needed. For example, how many people in the United States would say amen to free trade? You're going to hear something about free trade, how free trade comes directly from the devil. There's no question about it. We've got the pedigree, we've got the begats. Huh? But people believe in it. People believe in it not knowing that free trade is destroying them. It's destroying our agriculture. It's destroyed our industries. It's destroyed our finances. They've got houses that are being built here as a result of free trade in this area. You can see them. Now, the house probably has a 40 or 50-year mortgage on it, and the house might last 30 years if you don't have a 40-mile wind at any time. The houses are made of what they call chipboard, which I prefer to call flake board, for the obvious reason. And why do people live in that when people used to live in houses that were 50, 100 years old? May not have been looked as fancy on the outside, but they worked. Why has that happened to us? Why have our lives been ruined? Largely because of free trade, which comes directly from the devil. Why people believe it? Well, you have to go through that, don't you? You have to say, well, people who believe in free trade are obviously dupes. That's heavy, but that's necessary. Because if you can't free them from that, you can't save the nation. Because what are you going to do? You're going to say, well, the federal government has the power in a bankruptcy situation to create a currency, to set up a national bank, and to provide low-cost credit, that is at 2% on the long term, 1% on the long term, to the purpose of construction of major infrastructural projects. And that these projects will have subcontractors who will be private subcontractors, will give them credit too. And through that kind of lending by the federal government, through big government, we can revive this economy by having a policy which is based simply on creating a given number of millions of useful jobs for things we need done. And that'll work. And someone screams, no, big government. That's the wrong direction. We got to get government out. We got too much government. Problem is too much taxes, too much government. Well, if the fellow believes that, and enough people believe that, there's no hope of saving this nation or civilization. So you've got to become heavy in your conversation. Don't propitiate, don't stroke. Tell the truth. See, light conversation generally amounts to lying, doesn't it? It's otherwise known as hypocrisy, which is a nice name for lying. Tell the truth.
That is the actual difference between a Republican citizenry and a group of subjects. The people who are prepared to tell the truth about something as opposed to continually lie. And by the way, the last section of this, in which Lynn discussed free trade, was exactly the issue that came up around the matter of Ukraine. That is, the Yanukovych administration, presidential administration in Ukraine, had refused to join the EU because they wanted to have continued relations with Russia and countries of the European Economic Union, the EEU. But the problem was, although Russia had a free trade relationship with agreement with Ukraine, under the conditions under which they came into the WTO, they had tariffs and various restrictions with the other countries of Europe. So if Ukraine joined the EU, then this meant that all of the earlier agreements that the Russians had signed would automatically be abrogated. So what Ukrainian president was talking about was, well, we can have relations with both. Doesn't seem that that should be a problem. That's what he thought. And therefore, he announced that that was his intention. And the day he announced it, the first of the demonstrations of the Maidan began. And the overthrow, which was done illegally by the United States, largely, and also forces in NATO, of the democratically elected government there, led to all of the things during the period of 2014, which were the cause of the present conflict. So in looking at this excerpt, which was made, of course, by Lyndon LaRouche in the 1990s, we get also a clear idea of the difference between discussing what people would prefer to discuss and discussing what it's necessary to discuss. There's a recent example of this involving an academic professor by the name of Michael Brennan, who has just turned 80 years old and is well known and well respected in his field, and he's been run out of his field because of his views of Vladimir Putin. He had something to say, which we're going to put up on the screen and read along. What we're getting, he says, is not only a cartoon caricature, but a portrait of the country and its leadership. And by the way, Putin is not a dictator. He is, Putin himself, an extraordinarily sophisticated thinker, but people don't bother to read what he writes or to listen to what he says. I know, in fact, of no national leader that has laid out in the detail and the precision and the sophistication his view of the world, Russia's place in it, the character of interstate relations with the character and acuity that he has. It's not a question of whether you believe that the depiction that he offers is entirely correct, but you are dealing with a person and a regime which is in vital respects the antithesis of the one that is caricatured and almost universally accepted, not only in the Biden administration, but in the foreign policy community and the political class in general. Now, the extraordinary danger of these misestimates, or this engaging in light conversation, or the idea that Joe Biden said something like, well, I don't understand why the Russians think that we're at war with them. All we're doing is helping the Ukrainians defend themselves by sending them all sorts of munitions and sending them all sorts of training and all sorts of weapons and so on. And also, of course, I happen to believe that Putin is not a legitimate head of state, and he's a barbarian. He's a genocidalist. But I don't think that there's any reason he ought to think that we're at war with him. When you're in a realm in which that kind of thing is being stated, it's important to try to ask the question, where does this all come from and how does this all work? Now, we have had Mike Robinson on several times, and of course, in the course of today, we've made very clear that there's a different sort of set of initiatives from the Anglosphere in general that are occurring. But today is much different because I think we're here to really sort of deliberate on what the latest is that's from there, but also what does this overall picture mean? What are we really looking at in terms of cyber warfare, you could call it, the manipulation of information, the march of disinformation, but it's got sort of broader implications, I think, for all of us in terms of how we're going to proceed. So, Mike, we're happy to have you with us. We want you to feel no restriction on anything that you've heard in terms of fitting it in, because we already know every time you come on, you bring not only food for thought, but a new provocation such that people have to reorient how they are thinking about the narrative, if you want to put it that way, that they're being presented with. So go right ahead. Let's see what you have for us today.
Well, thank you. I mean, Harley, at the beginning, discussed the fact that the information war, and so I just want to start off with that a little bit. Now, you'll have seen this first graphic before. This is Theresa May, and she was saying in 2018 that the G7 leaders, at her instigation, had agreed to establish a new rapid response mechanism. And so what that was about was controlling the narrative, controlling the information war, was effectively setting up the front lines of the information battle. Now, just on Thursday this past week, again, driven by the UK, but the EU produced this is the EU and international partners put forward a declaration for the future of the internet. And it was co-signed by a number of countries, including the United Kingdom, but also Ukraine, Poland, Moldova, and a whole bunch of other countries there. And what was this about? Well, here is Nadine Dorries, who's the Secretary of State for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport in the UK. And she said, through a forked tongue, as open societies, we should be clear that we will resist attempts to bring the internet under restrictive government control or to regulate it through concentrated top-down processes. Now, she's lying through her teeth when she says this, because she knows very well that her online safety bill is going through the British Parliament at the moment. And a key aspect of this is the concept of legal but harmful content. And what is the definition of this? The UK government has made it clear that they view harmful content as being any content which carries a narrative counter to the British government's narrative. They call this misinformation and disinformation. This is what they're extremely concerned about. We've talked about it on this program before. And this online safety bill is geared towards, in the UK, the likes of the UK Column or other alternative media platforms. It's also about social media and making sure that the narrative is controlled on there. But that leaves the broadcast media. So the government published just this week this, which is a white paper. It's called Up Next, the government's vision for the broadcasting sector. And when they're talking about the broadcasting sector, they're not only talking about broadcast television in terms of BBC News or Channel 4 News or anything which is broadcast over terrestrial television, but they're also talking about streaming services, internet streaming services. They're talking about smart TVs and these kinds of things. And so what they're proposing is legislation very similar to the online safety bill, but focused on broadcast television. So streaming platforms will be legally required to give what they describe as prominence to public service broadcasters. There are two public service broadcasters in the UK. One is the BBC and the other one is Channel 4. They are the, let's say, the biggest proponents of government narrative in the country. Then streaming companies would be required to protect the public from harmful content. Again, this is undefined at this point, other than what is, at least it's undefined as far as legislation or white papers is concerned. It's defined as far as government narratives are concerned. And the final thing they made very clear was that only public service broadcasters would get rights to major sporting events. So why is that important? Well, of course, public service broadcasters have to broadcast information in a particular way and carry particular types of information. And if the only way for a private streaming company, for example, to get access to popular sporting events is to become a public service broadcaster, then of course that's going to encourage more participants in that idea. So this is, again, more control of the narrative. But that's the UK. What about the EU? They have the Digital Services Act, ensuring safe and accountable online environment. This is very similar to the online safety bill and will bring in very similar types of restrictions on what people can say and do on the internet. And of course, as you will undoubtedly know, just the news from the last couple of days is that the Department for Homeland Security is creating a disinformation governance board. So whereas in the UK and the EU, we intend to legislate on this, in the United States, legislation doesn't seem to be the direction of travel. And you are going to have this guy setting this up within the Department of Homeland Security. And who's going to be in charge of this? Well, the headline from Blaze News there says, appoints leader who peddled disinformation about Hunter Biden laptop. That's this lady, Nita Jankovic, and that's a tweet from 2020 when she was doing just that. Here's another one from 2021 doing something similar. But I thought this was the interesting bit about Nina, because of course she was an advisor to the Ukrainian government on strategic communications under the auspices of a Fulbright Clinton Public Policy Fellowship. So the point is here that beginning with Theresa May in 2018 at the G7, she encouraged all G7 countries to get involved in the rapid response mechanism, which was all about building common narratives across the G7. And we'll hear more about the G7 towards the end of this. But the point is that common narrative building is now established within the UK and legislation, within the EU and legislation, and now within the United States as well. That's the domestic narrative. What about the foreign narrative? We've mentioned this man before as well. This is Andy Price, who is the head of counter-disinformation and media development. This is a department within the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. And I'm just going to run very quickly through this because they were talking about Russian disinformation, a sustained Russian disinformation campaign. This is going back several years, so well before Ukraine was ever considered a possible flashpoint. But already Britain was very much pushing the notion of Russian disinformation, putting hundreds of millions of pounds into countering that, including projects in the Baltic states, Ukraine, and pan-regional narratives, and of course using other British soft power organisations like the British Council to do that. And well, of course, one of the Foreign Commonwealth Office's primary disinformation programs was the Integrity Initiative. We've talked about that before in the past, so I'm not going to go into detail on this either, but this was using various journalists, all kinds of people to push an anti-Russian narrative for many, many years now in an attempt to build an idea of what Russia is in the minds of the British public and internationally for a very long time. We've also mentioned this lady who's formerly BBC Media Action talking about Syria. And one of the things that is absolutely clear now is that the propaganda and the information narrative that's being built by the G7 nations. It's basically the same narrative building mechanisms, shall we say, the same propaganda mechanisms as have been trialed in Syria first. So if you remember, she was talking about working in 2004 with individuals within Syrian ministry who want to change and to encourage them to be the drivers of that. This is an offshoot of the BBC going into a foreign country and effectively working towards regime change. All media development work, she said, that's been done in Syria has been predicated upon the idea that there can be change from within. You find who the reformers are and you work with them on that. I just wanted to make the point that BBC Media Action, absolutely active in Ukraine as well for many years, and funded by the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. In this case, this particular project, building capacity with one of the major TV stations in Ukraine. And the funder for this was the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office Good Governance Fund. So let's just have a brief look at that. So this is supporting a series of governance and economic reform initiatives aimed at building stability. And you can assume that whatever they say it's aimed at, you can turn it around 180 degrees to really understand what they're doing. So aimed at building stability, reducing poverty and increasing prosperity in Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Armenia and North Macedonia. So that's where that work is mainly going on, and it has a budget of, or it had a budget that year of £90 million. Let's just briefly look at who's involved in this. The Conflict Stability and Security Fund is one of the mechanisms that the money gets delivered, and the Conflict Stability and Security Fund was the main mechanism for funding Syrian rebels whenever British money was going to them, and funding the narrative in Syria as well. And you can see that the implementing partners there include Crown Agents and PricewaterhouseCoopers. But one of the key people from the Syrian narrative has now popped up in Ukraine. As I say, many parallels between Syria and Ukraine. And this is David Knott, Dr. David Knott, the war surgeon, who the BBC says was helping doctors save lives in Ukraine. But if we go back a few years, the BBC was telling us that, he was claiming that Russia had hacked his computers in Syria and had discovered the hospital that he was working at in Syria. And that led to Syria striking that hospital, bombing that hospital. And so David Knott pushing an anti-Russian narrative back in 2018. But even before that, he was pushing another narrative. So he was claiming that Syrian snipers were shooting pregnant women in the stomach to win cigarettes. And this was 2013. He was making this claim, and they published this image of the X-ray of a baby with apparently a bullet in the head. But many people criticized this image at the time, basically said that he was telling untruths because, of course, a fetus of that age, if it had been hit by a bullet, would not be in the recognizable state that it is in. But David Knott has other connections, and we were talking about this on the UK Column News this week. So I just want to give a few seconds here to my colleague Vanessa Bailey, who was talking about David Knott and his connections and the similar connections in Syria.
Coming back to Dr. Knott, he is also a member of Medics Under Fire, an organization on the board are a number of players, both in Syria and now in Ukraine. First of all, Hamish de Breton-Gordon, who was the purveyor of the alleged chemical attack narratives in Syria, including the debunked and discredited Duma attack in 2018. And he is notorious for his fantastical invention of the fridge bomb, believed to be connected to British intelligence, to MI6. There's also Toby Cadman, who we know to have been employed by the UK Foreign Office to criminalize on a legal basis the Syrian government. But we also have Dr. Saleha Hassan, who we would know as one of the actors in the BBC Panorama Saving Syria's Children that was forensically debunked by researcher Robert Stewart. So already we see the kind of people that he's working alongside regarding Syria. And now, of course, he pops up miraculously alongside Hamish de Bretton-Gordon in Ukraine. But coming back to...
Oops. So there we go. So basically, the same apparatus is now moved out of Syria and into Ukraine. And we're seeing the same type of propaganda, very much the same types of narratives coming out. And so this is part of the control of the information war. So they've got to shut down any counter narratives while they put their people in the correct places to make sure that the BBC, Channel 4, and the other Western media have all the right kinds of talking heads to explain to the general public what is going on. Now, I want to move on then to one of the efforts to sort of expose some of what is going on, and what two people, and these were two Russian people admittedly, played a prank recently on the Defence Secretary in the UK, Ben Wallace. These two are known as Vovan and Lexus, and they run prank calls. So in this case, they were pretending to be the Prime Minister of Ukraine, and somehow they managed to get through to speak to Ben Wallace while he was in Poland, discussing one of his efforts to get arms into Ukraine. And so I just want to show a little excerpt from this, and then we'll talk about some of the other information that Ben Wallace hemorrhaged while he was talking. So just have a quick listen to this.
I also would like to request provide never NLAW anti-tank weapons, since those delivered earlier often fail. So that was problems for our country.
Ours have. I don't think ours have failed. I've got the details of ours. We've given you over 4,000. We've got more coming.
Yeah, right.
We're running out of our own. But I speak to Minister Reznikov or text him.
So that was Wallace absolutely hemorrhaged so much information in the course of that call. The call actually lasted about 10 minutes or so, and the full video was available on YouTube. But naturally, the British government worked very hard to have that taken down, and it was taken down. So let's just briefly have a look at the information that he hemorrhaged. This was 3 or 4 weeks ago now. He said that the UK had supplied over 4,000 NLAW anti-tank weapons to the war zone. He said that there were 2 smuggling routes. He said that new Stinger delivery, there would be a new Stinger delivery with night capability. He said that the UK was sharing intelligence with Kiev, that the UK was moving naval assets into the Black Sea, that the UK was planning naval provocations in the Black Sea, that the UK was planning a next stage of NATO involvement to include direct fighting with Russia. And so the conclusion that could be drawn from this was that ministers had committed the UK and the UK electorate to a war with Russia. Well, I think that was absolutely correct. But the point here is that showed very clearly how the narrative could be taken apart, because at that point, the British government had not mentioned or stated publicly how many weapons had been given to Ukraine. That was the first time that information had come out, and within a couple of days of that, well, first of all, Ben Wallace was busy tweeting about how reprehensible it was that he'd been caught out in this way, that these nasty Russians were really plumbing the depths by running a gag like this. But then within a couple of days, they had to make a press release to admit to what had happened here. So it is possible to trip the narrative up, shall we say, with the right kind of action. Now, Harley mentioned Tobias Ellwood MP during his presentation, and I just wanted to give to show a little clip from the presentation. He was giving this to the Royal United Services Institute, which is a defence think tank in the UK, a few days ago. And Harley quoted a little bit of this, but I just wanted to let you hear it from his own words, because there was a little bit that wasn't in the publicly published quote. So just have a listen to this.
Are far from exhibiting the scale of statecraft that was on display during the Cold War, that we learned during the Cold War. The art of understanding, assessing, and taking calculated collective risk without fear of losing control of that escalatory ladder. We are doing enough, in my mind, to prevent Ukraine from losing, but not enough to ensure that they win. And these debates over whether to dispatch Polish MiG planes is just one prime example of this. I'm really pleased to see that some nations are actually breaking away, including Britain, from NATO's collective hesitance. All credit to the Defense Secretary for doing more from Britain's perspective, both before the invasion with those critical end laws that would have been invaluable to the Ukrainian forces. And now I understand today we're looking at gifting Mastiffs, other armored personnel vehicles as well. But we're doing this outside of the umbrella of NATO. And if that's the case, exactly that's what we should do. Create a coalition of the willing. And I stress this because time is running out.
So outside the hesitancy of NATO, who is this gentleman? Well, he is a member of the UK Parliament, of course. He's also the chairman of the Defence Select Committee, and this is supposed to hold the Ministry of Defence to account. But he's not just that, because he's also Lieutenant Colonel in 77 Brigade, which, as most people will know if you've seen my earlier presentations, is part of the narrative control mechanism. It is there to fight an information war. They claim that they don't fight the information war, 77 Brigade particularly don't fight the information war domestically, that it's fighting that information war abroad. It's specifically to counter Russian disinformation and so on. So this is an extremely influential person. And for him to make a statement like that, I think Harley didn't overstate it in any way. Now, I also wanted to mention, just to finish off here, the Mansion House speech. Let's just put the Mansion House on screen, because the Mansion House is important. This is the home and the office of the official residence of the Lord Mayor of London. That's the City of London, not London as in the capital of the UK. And so this is used for City of London's official functions. So as Harley mentioned, 2 annual dinners. The Easter banquet, which is the one that's just taken place, is the main speaker is usually the Foreign Secretary. And then in June, there's one where the Chancellor of the Exchequer talks about economic issues. And I just wanted to run through some of the comments that the delightful and lovely Liz Truss made. So she was talking about weapons and being sent before the war started, that Ukrainian troops were being trained by the British before the war started. But she was very upset that the world should have done more to deter what she called as the invasion. She said that the UK shouldn't provide heavy weapons for fear of provoking something worse, but that inaction would be the greatest provocation. It's the time for courage and not caution, she said, and that we must ensure that alongside Ukraine, the Western Balkans and countries like Moldova and Georgia have the resilience and capabilities to maintain their sovereignty. And then she was saying that NATO's open door policy is sacrosanct. If Finland and Sweden choose to join in response to Russia's aggression, we must integrate them as soon as possible. And the thing that most people aren't aware of is that Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, Liz Truss, the Foreign Secretary, and Boris Johnson himself have been working extremely hard over the last 3 or 4 months to encourage Sweden and Finland to join NATO. There have been meetings in London and in those countries to try to encourage them to join, and they seem to now be preparing to do so. She went on, we also reject the false choice between Euro-Atlantic security and Indo-Pacific security. In the modern world, we need both. So China is the next target. We need a global NATO. Harley mentioned this. By that, I don't mean extending the membership to those from other regions. I mean that NATO must have a global outlook, ready to tackle global threats. That means China. Countries must play by the rules, and that includes China, she said. Beijing has not condemned Russian aggression or its war crimes. Give them a slap on the wrist. Russian exports to China rose by almost a third in the first quarter of this year. They are commenting on who should or shouldn't be a member of NATO. And they are rapidly building a military capable of projecting power deep into areas of European strategic interest. So this is all China that she's talking about here. And then she went on to say that China is not impervious. By talking about the rise of China is inevitable, we're doing China's work for it. In fact, their rise isn't inevitable. They will not continue to rise if they don't play by the rules. So we're now threatening. And China needs trade with the G7. We represent half of the global economy. And we have choices. We've shown with Russia the kind of choices we're prepared to make when international rules are violated. So G7 is going to wage economic war on China. And she said that brings on to the final point, which is that our prosperity and security must be built on a network of strong partnerships. This is what I've described as the network of liberty. In a world where malign actors are trying to undermine multilateral institutions, we know that bilateral and plurilateral groups will play a greater role. Partnerships like NATO, the G7, and the Commonwealth are vital. We should keep strengthening our NATO alliance with bonds around the world, like the UK-led Joint Expeditionary Force, the Five Eyes, and the AUKUS partnership we have with the US and Australia. And she said the G7 should act as an economic NATO, collectively defending our prosperity. If the economy of a partner is being targeted by an aggressive regime, we should act to support them, all for one and one for all. And finally, the aggressors are prepared to be bold. We must be bolder. That's how across the globe we will win this new era for peace, security, and prosperity. So war is peace, and we're now looking at perpetual war, not only with Russia, but with China. That seems to be what Global Britain is about. But Global Britain can't be about that if unless they have complete control of the narrative, and that is very much what they're aiming for. So where do we go from here? We've got to deal with that issue, because without that, without the ability to counter that narrative, I think we basically have to keep hold of that, and that's where I want to end for this evening. Dennis.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Mike. Harley, let me just ask you for any response you have to anything that Mike has said, or anything that you had either from Lynn, any response to that, the one.
Well, I want to thank Mike for that presentation, because he has just devastated a line you hear all the time from pragmatic Americans, the kind of people Lyndon LaRouche was talking about. They say, why are you talking about Britain? There's no such thing as the British Empire. This is a fictitious theory that comes from Lyndon LaRouche. Well, I think it's one of the things he pointed to, which demonstrates the fraud of that way of thinking, is when Liz Truss said, we were training and arming the Ukrainians before the war. This is typical of how the British Empire works. They choose their locations, they choose their spots, and they act. And they create a circumstance where the United States has to come in with them. I believe it was Tobias Ellwood who was critical in his speech of Biden, who he said was very, very hesitant. And that's why he said the United Kingdom has to be the vanguard. So what we just heard from Mike is absolute proof that from the standpoint of the narrative, and how the narrative then shapes the policy, as we see what Ben Wallace was talking about, the defense minister, what Truss was talking about, that they use the narrative to then move the forces. And for those who still have this line, there's no British Empire, you're the biggest victims of British psychological warfare, because that's exactly what they want you to think.
Okay, we have a couple of questions. So let me ask this one to Carly. I think this is primarily, although Mike, if you have anything to say about it, this is from Ernie. He asks, please discuss Donald Trump's response to the Ukraine conflict. That's the first part of the question. And the second part was, what has been the role of George Soros's organization in Ukraine?
Well, as far as Trump is concerned, I don't know what his role is. I'm not sure what he's been saying other than talking about himself. You know, he had this comment the other day that he would tell Putin that the U.S. has the strongest nuclear force in the world and you better not mess with us. Now, some of this is partly to contrast himself to what many people see as Biden being weak. But I think if you were to ask the Russians, if you were to look at this situation, you'd see the United States is not being weak. The United States is putting weapons in, putting intelligence and security in, and also supporting the narrative. The U.S. is among the leading, or I should say the U.S. administration, debunking the idea that there are Nazis in Ukraine. So I think with what would be good if Trump really did want to play a role in this would be to step up right now. He has said, look, we cannot afford going to nuclear war. And he's afraid that's where we're headed. Well, then he should join us and issue a call for a new security architecture, which recognizes that the NATO policy after 1990 towards Russia, after the fall of the Soviet Union, was wrong, and that the continuation of the refusal to accept security guarantees for Russia is also wrong. And I think rather than talking about what he would say or what he would do, that there's something he could do that would be very valuable. And it has nothing to do with praising or defending Putin. It has to do with asserting that we are headed toward nuclear war if this continues, and that he would insist that the security guarantees that Putin has requested are legitimate and should be recognized. So that's what I would say in terms of the situation with Trump. What was the second part, Dennis?
George Soros and his role in Ukraine.
Well, I think it's pretty well known that Soros, through his various funds and think tanks, was a big supporter of the 2014 Maidan coup. Just as Soros was involved throughout the world with the Arab Spring, with the color revolutions that went on through the former Soviet republics. And Soros's intent in this is to create a world which is totally free for the speculators to loot with impunity, because that's what he is. The idea that he's promoting freedom and democracy, it's what kind of freedom and democracy? Neoliberal freedom to loot the world. And as you mentioned, Dennis, the attempt to stop Ukraine from forming or sustaining an agreement with Russia by Yanukovych, that was one of Soros's major targets. And in doing that, Soros, who's supposedly known as a left liberal, was completely in bed with the neoconservatives typified by Victoria Nuland and her husband, Robert Kagan, who's one of the central figures in the neoconservative movement. And it also put Soros absolutely in bed with Joe Biden, because Biden was the Clinton point man on Ukraine.
Okay, fine. This one is for you, Mike. This is from Jose, who's asking. He's actually out doing petitioning, but he knew you were going to be on. He wanted you to describe, and you actually showed it, the city of London, and make a clarification, because he tries to explain this, especially to people in the streets, the difference between London and the city of London, and also what it represents as a power center, distinct both from the city, but from London itself, and its importance in terms of intelligence and finance.
Well, the City of London, of course, is the financial centre of the UK. It's what can we say about it? It is the notional square mile which sits in the centre of London, but it is separate from London in many ways. It's established as a corporation, and it is the financial centre, probably with it and Wall Street certainly are the main two financial centers on the planet. So I think Harley was talking about the central banking cartel during his presentation. This is what that epitomizes, and so it's significant that particular. I should have mentioned actually. if you look at the Mansion House speeches and you just look at what Wikipedia says about that, I don't like Wikipedia as such, but this is a quote from it. It says the most famous Mansion House speech was the Mansion House speech of 1911 by David Lloyd George, which warned the German Empire against opposing British influence during the period leading up to the First World War. I just thought that was an interesting observation because I think there could be some parallels drawn with what Liz Truss presented in her speech. But you know, the City of London is effectively the heart of what it is we're fighting at the moment, I think.
Okay. Harley, this is from Adam. He's asking this question. It's actually for both of you. It'd be interesting for what you'd have to say about this, Mike. How can the English overthrow the British crown system and adopt the Republican system advocated by Shelley and other great English humanists? Okay, so why don't you take that, Harley? Let's see what you do with it. And then we'll see if Mike has anything to say.
I'm interested in what Mike has to say about it. Well, look, I'll tell you what I think is most interesting here is that this is a system which is collapsing. And with all their purported power, their control of the narrative, their control of finance, their control of governments through finance, they're losing it. You know, there are now something like 40 nations which are deeply in debt, which are headed toward default, led by Sri Lanka. But there are 40 other nations that are going to have to be bailed out with huge amounts of money. And it's not the nations that get bailed out. This just adds to their debt as the banks launder money through them to pay themselves back to keep the scam going. So the City of London and Wall Street are in deep trouble. This is reflected in this article I mentioned from The Economist, the April 22nd issue, where what they're really complaining about is that the so-called emerging nations, plus the so-called autocratic nations that support Russia, represent the majority of the world's population. And if we were to see a shift away from the petrodollar US Anglo-American financial system, where countries would begin to engage in trade with regional currency blocks, with baskets of currency, but currencies which are not controlled by printing presses, dictated by the private banks and the needs of the private banks, but the currency was based on what's needed to build the physical economy. That's how you could defeat the so-called power of the invisible empire of finance. Now, that's what they fear. Now, how do you do that? Well, the first thing you do is you make it clear that the wars we're seeing, that the poverty we're seeing, the famine that's spreading across the globe, the breakdown in healthcare, all of this is because of the control of the interlocking gang of cartels, whether it's finance and insurance, hedge funds, big pharma, raw material cartels, and so on. They're the ones who are imposing these policies that are detrimental to all of mankind. So if people understand that, instead of being in awe that these are the masters of the universe that are so rich and have such large yachts and control the media and the politicians, if they realize these are people who are scared bunnies right now. They're scared of the Russia-China alliance. They're scared of countries like Pakistan and India lining up with Russia and China. You know, Boris Johnson just went on a hasty mission to India to try to jawbone the Prime Minister Modi to get the Indians to come back to the British Empire, essentially, in terms of siding with them. He was unsuccessful. You know, the ability of countries to stand up now gives us in the United States and in the United Kingdom should give us a sense that our time has come. And so instead of sitting there complaining about how weak we are and how powerful they are, what we have to do is go out and mobilize around a program which will put these fake powers into bankruptcy reorganization through the institutions of government. Now, in the United States, we have a constitution we can use to do that. It's a little more difficult in England, which doesn't really have a constitution and which does not give sovereignty to the people. But that's something, look, that could be arranged, and that's what I'd like to hear Mike talk about.
Well, look, I think not much is going to happen until this present queen leaves this mortal coil. Certainly, her offspring are significantly less popular, and there may be opportunities there. But look, a couple of points I wanted to make, just based on what Harley said there. Back in 2013, I think it was, there was a big effort to intervene in Syria, to bomb Syria, and that was prevented because the UK government decided they couldn't proceed with it. There was no public support for it. There was quite an effective campaign run at that time to prevent any bombing of Syria. And what was two things interesting about that. First of all, the fact that that was a perfect demonstration of when people said no to the government, they could not proceed. But the other thing was that the United States couldn't proceed either because Britain wasn't doing it. So I just want to echo what Harley was saying there. People have got to recognize the power that they have to change events, and that was just one example of it.
Yeah, it's interesting that you made that link, actually, which is a natural link, but important because people do often forget how that process around that Syria bombing business happened. We're getting a couple of different questions. Now, there's sort of a tendency in some of these questions, so I'm going to reference it. And it's basically around weapons production, weapons trafficking. There's one from Thomas. Do you think China will help Russia with weapons? Then there are other questions basically sort of wondering whether or not the entirety of this is about promoting a kind of military bonanza in weapons manufacturing, either in the United States or throughout Europe. Also, there's another kind of question around the financial arrangements, since I think most of all of this stuff is all loans. And I believe that the Russians had said something about debt trap. So that's another question. So just take those as a group, a sort of orientation, and see what you want to do with that. We've got one or two others in addition. So
I'll start. Yeah, I can start. I mean, there has to be a rethinking of what this military-industrial complex is, because it's not just defense contractors. That may have been the main element that was identified by President Eisenhower in his farewell address. But this has since changed dramatically through the horizontal and vertical integration of the corporate cartels. You look at boards of directors and you see the same people showing up, whether it's an arms company or a big pharma or a for-profit prison system. You have a group of what you might call the ruling political class that is integrated into these different boards. And they have the same policies. Their policies are privatization, deregulation, tear down government. We saw that in Lynn's comments where he was talking about the practical man who says, well, the problem is government's too big. No, the problem is government is in the wrong hands. Government is supposed to be an instrument of the people. But when you allow corporate cartels to take over the institutions of government, as they have with the executive branch, as they have with the Congress, when you allow that to occur, then you really can't complain if their policies benefit a small number of privileged people at the expense of the many. So when it comes to arms production in the war, of course they benefit from this. And I mean, one of the things about arms production is once you shoot something off, it's no longer useful. So you need to produce another one. I read somewhere that the United States is running out of Stinger missiles to send to Ukraine. Well, so you order some more. There's a joke going around in Berlin that with the auto industry being destroyed by the green policy, by the opposition to use of fossil fuels and so on, with possibly 1.5 to 2 million jobs set to be lost by this restructuring, well, maybe it's a good idea to send weapons to Ukraine because you can build up an armaments industry in Germany. Now, that's one of those kind of ironic or sick jokes, because we remember what happened last time there was a German rearmament. But it is true that the arms dealers in the arms industry want to produce weapons. They want to sell weapons. They want wars because that's when you can use them. As General Smedley Butler wrote, war is a racket. But it's not just about the money to the arms dealers. It's about the control of policy and the control of the minds. And that's why it's so important that we got this report from Mike on this whole question of who runs the disinformation business, because that's the way this thing works. If you're focused narrowly on how arms companies want war because they make money from it, you miss the bigger picture, which is that we're contending, our view, and I think it's totally provable, that the reason Ukraine is being set up as a battering ram against Russia is because the Western transatlantic financial system is collapsing. Not just the defense sector, but the whole system is collapsing. The defense sector is actually relatively robust, but the whole system is collapsing, and there's an emergence of an alternative counterpole in the East, in Eurasia. There's no reason why the West can't be part of that. And I've made this point before in these meetings, that the United States was the original anti-colonial world power. And instead of functioning as a sidekick to imperial global Britain, we should side with the emerging nations against this colonial policy. And that's where the new economic and financial architecture would come in, based on Lyndon LaRouche's idea of major infrastructure projects and infrastructure representing the new platforms based on scientific and technological advance, and why we also need massive investment in new areas such as fusion and space technologies.
Mike, before you answer this, there's some I want to add in another element, because other things are coming in as we're talking. One of the things that I think gets lost in all this is what is happening industrially also in Europe as a result of much of this. I mean, obviously, with the gas cutoffs with Poland and Bulgaria, we heard about that. But there's also other elements, I mean, even gearing up for this kind of military production. And so even as we were asking about what are the capacities for the transatlantic to do some of these things, the other question is, which has been asked, is what's happening on the ground with people, or is there any discussion among the population, particularly in England, is what they were asking about, concerning this shift into war production? Is this something that people think they're part of? Is it something that they're watching at a distance? Has anything been said at all? So that was another question that came in.
I don't think there's any real discussion about that side of it. There's obviously an awareness that a lot of stuff is being sent to Ukraine, but there's been no sort of public discussion in the media or in general about how that's being replaced, or who's paying for that, or so on. I saw this week, by the way, that I can't remember the institution that published this, but the amount of money being spent on the arms industry and on military production now is ticked over £2 trillion. I think it was pounds or dollars for the first time ever. I think that though, I mean, you heard in the little clip from Ben Wallace that I showed that he was saying that the British anti-tank weapons weren't failing, whereas others were. And so a lot of people observing that countries have been taking the opportunity to get rid of older arms into Ukraine, and of course that's going to require replacement. I think Harley said something about, or maybe you, Dennis, said something about mainly being loans. We're saying yes, from the UK side, it seems to be mainly loans to Ukraine. Of course, we've seen the IMF offering a whole load of loans in the form of special drawing rights and so on. But you know, if we're giving away large stockpiles of arms, those are going to have to be replaced where's the money for that going to come from? Particularly bearing in mind the US, I know, is in as bad, if not worse, condition. But you know, the devastation to the public budget of the last 2 years of COVID and you know, the economic devastation as well. And the question is, do we even have the productive capability to replace what we're giving away at the moment? That conversation hasn't really been had yet here either.
Okay. Yeah. Now, there's a question, Harley, from Iman, and he asked this. If the United States military have been fooled as to who they're really serving, aren't they the people who it's most important to reach? That's his question.
Well, I think that's an important question. Now, how you reach the military is another whole organizing conundrum. But one thing I would say about that is that from some of the people I've had discussions with, you look at people such as Scott Ritter, who ex-Marine, weapons inspector. You look at Colonel Douglas McGregor. You can see that there are a number of people with military backgrounds who are speaking out, and who are speaking out quite forcefully about the foolishness of this idea that somehow Russia is being beaten back by the brave Ukrainian people. And I think there's no question that there are people in Ukraine who are sacrificing their lives in what they think is a fight for their country. But as I said earlier, they're victims of the psychological warfare operation that caused the war to take place in the first place. The military, there are many people in the military who are putting the brakes on this idea of sending U.S. forces in. You know, Biden has said repeatedly, we're not going to fight, we're not going to be on the ground, even as he is facilitating a bigger NATO involvement. But I suspect that there's a pullback, especially from more senior people in the military. And I refer especially, people can find a number of interviews with Colonel Douglas McGregor, who's clear on this. Now, in terms of how do you reach the military, you have to remember a lot people who are in the military have families. The real issue is, how do you reach the American people with the truth? And the same thing in Europe. How do you reach the population? And we have relatively small forces in terms of a deployable force, but we're doing certain things that are kind of a spearhead. And I would just call people's attention to what we're doing in New York with Diane Sayre's campaign, and in Texas with Joel DeJean's campaign, where we have two candidates who are providing leadership for the whole population. Now, we also just got an announcement from our French organization that after the disastrous election between Le Pen and Macron, and disastrous not because of the outcome, but because neither side really represented the true interests of France, we're going to be running a slate of 12 candidates for the assembly, but in a collaboration with probably up to another 70 candidates to try to present an alternative to the people of France, to the situation that they have regarding NATO and the European Union. So I think while it's true we could reach people in the military, the broader approach is what's necessary.
Mike, I'm going to give you this question. I think you might find this question interesting. I think that the person that asked it is going to find your answer very interesting. They say this. This is actually Thomas again. I heard that the elite all graduated from Georgetown University. What are your thoughts on that? I think it might give you an opportunity to say a little bit about how educational institutions that are elite actually work in comparison of, the United States and England, Great Britain.
To be honest, you've caught me on that one. Where do I go with that? Sorry, Dennis. I actually just give me that again, please, because
okay. Here's what his question was. Here's what he said. I heard that the elite all graduated from Georgetown University. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I hadn't heard that.
Neither have I.
Right. So I'm not really sure how to answer that. I mean, most of the elites in the UK have come from Oxford and Cambridge, and prior to that, of course, the likes of Eton and Harrow and these types of private, well, what we call private schools, which are private in the sense that they cost a lot of money to send your children there. So we have a very special education system in this country, and of course those two main universities are, the people are selected from those to enter various types of public service in this country, whether that be in the intelligence services or various other senior foreign office roles and so on. People are selected from those two universities mainly. So in terms of Britain, that would be the main source, I would have thought, for from the education system.
Yeah, well, you see, if you were asking here, you see, Harley might say the elite all come from Rutgers. I'm not.
Nah. No, actually, though, Dennis, what I would say is that a lot of the functionaries in the administrative bureaucracies do go to Georgetown and George Washington and American University. They are oriented toward those kinds of programs. You have Tufts in foreign service, but the actual elite primarily go through Harvard and Yale. And this is where you find the training programs going back to William Yandell Elliott, the key Anglophile who unleashed the people like Kissinger and Brzezinski on the United States. Yale, you have the skull and bones, the bureaucracy, the administrative of the wealthy families there. But Georgetown does provide a lot of the functionaries. But again, I think when you talk about the elite, the interconnection is Wall Street, and many of the people who end up at Yale and Harvard are products of Wall Street and corporate cartels.
All right, I think. Yeah, I think I'm going to basically close at this point. I mean, we have a few other questions, but both because of time, actually, we only have another 10 minutes. Today, we have to really close by 4 our time here. So let me just pose the following. I mean, obviously, we have in fact, in discussion this morning with Helga Sepp-LaRouche, we were remarking about the fact that people seem to have not a very clear idea how close the possibility of thermonuclear war, or for that matter, let's say total war, is. Given the remarks that you used, Harley, concerning Putin, the miscalculation, misperception of Putin that seems to be dominant, at least publicly dominant in the United States. The things that, Mike, you told us concerning both the questions of information warfare, but also specifically the positions of people like Elwood, Truss, and others. So let's just take this for a moment, and instead of the I think, incorrect idea that there's going to be a years-long war in Ukraine, which has been said by many people in a rather flippant way. Let's consider the idea that we're looking at a particular flashpoint, and what needs to happen. Let's say we were able to have access to the public in various ways, or gain it, and we needed to make it clear that a rollback of the transatlantic world from this madness has to happen. What do you think, Mike? Let me ask you first. What do you think are the best things that people can do, let's say over the next week or so, to acquaint themselves with what's going on? And then secondly, any other thoughts you have about that actual danger and how it's being amplified and what might be done to reverse that?
Look, one of the areas that we've been really trying to get through to people over the last couple of years has been how British defence policy has been changing in this period of time. And we've had I've shown some of the videos on previous appearances on this, but we've had rhetoric from various defence chiefs talking about entering an era of perpetual war, that the ideas of war and peace are outdated, that these binary ideas of war and peace are outdated, they're talking about maintaining a level of conflict which is just below the threshold of what they describe as a full kinetic war. So they're quite happy to run proxy wars in other countries, but they don't want to get involved in a full kinetic war themselves. But they do want to run an information war. They do want to run cyber warfare. They do want to, so they want to run effectively a hybrid conflict, but below the threshold. So they want to keep it going for as long as they forever, basically. So people have got to grasp that that's what the policy is, and that part and parcel of that policy means that I know that controlling a narrative is a key part of that. We in the UK, in the EU, each have the various legislation that's going through at the moment. That has to be fought because if that passes, life gets very much more difficult. We've got to maintain our ability to speak out and to tell the truth. And in the US, you have a whole new problem on your hands right now. I think that has to be a primary focus at this point, because if we can't manage to be able to explain to people freely what is going on, then we are in trouble. We've got to make sure that legislation in wherever we are is stopped, and we maintain the right to explain to people what is going on.
Okay, thanks a lot, Mike. Harley.
Well, I think what's necessary is a peace movement that's a real peace movement, which means based on what Lyndon LaRouche was talking about, heavy ideas, not just the absence of war, not just some kind of idea that we all want to sniff and smell the flowers and love everybody else, but an understanding that human civilization has had brief flowerings of moments where anything seemed possible. And many of those moments then were drowned in blood, in religious war, in ethnic warfare, in geopolitical warfare. And so people have to learn something about history from the inside. And we've talked about this before, about the role of dramatists like Schiller and Shakespeare to elevate the ability of a population to think. That's what Lynn was talking about. You know, you and I, Dennis, came through the peace movement from the 1960s where we saw it was a dead end, that in fact it was being manipulated into the early part of the environmental movement. And what LaRouche said to us is, you've got to learn history, you've got to learn economics, but you have to learn what is the actual nature of man. And so we need people who go out with heavy ideas with the sense that people can be shocked into recognizing that we are at a late moment in the possibility of the extinction of the human race. Don't be afraid of scaring people. They should be scared, but give them a sense that human beings have within ourselves the capacity for creative and loving intervention so that we can create a change. Now, I just want to add one other point here on this information war. A lot of people in the United States are looking to Elon Musk as the savior, you know, that his takeover of Twitter is somehow going to roll back disinformation. Well, you know, if you're going to rely on a billionaire to save the world, you're putting yourself in the same situation as those people who think that Klaus Schwab and the Davos crowd are going to do it. There's nothing special about Elon Musk and Twitter. What's necessary is people developing real ideas. The problem with Twitter is that it's an extremely limited forum for heavy ideas. And we have to develop in whatever way we can a capacity to generate discussion around the heavy ideas about a new security architecture, a new financial and economic architecture, based on understanding the nature of man. And so, you know, that's why I say, you know, Elon Musk, more power to him, but he's not going to solve the problem. It's only going to be solved when the average person recognizes that there's nothing good about being average, and you really should strive to become a factor in history.
Thanks a lot, Harley. Thanks a lot, Mike. This is going to be a vital discussion we're going to continue over the next weeks because of the urgent moment that we find ourselves in. We want to make sure that both of you make yourselves available to come back and talk with us about this. We want to also do now is to just make sure that people are aware of the petition that was being circulated by the Schiller Institute to convoke, which a conference actually began, but to convoke an international conference to establish a new security and development architecture for all nations. That is to say that really nations need to sit down and discuss this idea. And we've heard different echoes. Harley referenced an echo. Others have referenced echoes here concerning Liz Truss trying to respond to that initiative adversely. Then Xi Jinping actually responded to this initiative in his own way, much, much more productively with the idea of a global security initiative. And of course, that will be what would happen. People would come with different proposals as to how this new international security and development architecture would have to come together. You can't have security without economic development. That's one of the reasons that you see a natural division between the Anglosphere and the rest of the world, which used to be called the developing and the developed sector, but it's different because China is now a highly developed country. It used to be in the developing sector. If you go back and read things like Bobby Kennedy's 1968 To Seek a Better World, it was a short book that was put out for the campaign. It talks about China and talks about it as a most beleaguered, developing country, sort of like the way you would think of today, like Nigeria. And if you think about, therefore, the difference between the capacities of China today and compare what the United States was then to what the United States is now, you see, there's a much, much different world. And so when you talk about things even like the UN Security Council or other forms of international organization created after the Second World War, clearly there's an entirely different way in which the world has to be pulled together. And obsolete ideas of empire, visions or fantasies about empire are certainly not going to work. And so this petition that we showed there before, please go to the site and sign it, and also get involved in actually trying to actually get that around. Please, that's an important thing to do. Also, you should subscribe to the channel. What will come to that? Yeah, convoke an international conference to establish a new security and development architecture for all nations. There was an April 9th conference we did put together, which was the initiation of that process, but we are talking about this process of conferences and ultimately the nations of the world actually joining together to have that discussion. Subscribe to this channel, the LaRouche Organization channel, and you should do everything possible to contribute to our organization financially and otherwise. There's a lot of different activities that we're involved in, but there's nothing more important than calling everybody's attention today to this idea that we have a limited time, very limited time in which this danger of out of control total war going to nuclear war and thermonuclear war may ultimately not be up to the particular leaders. In fact, it is the case that it is ultimately, in one sense, up to us, those who think of ourselves perhaps as powerless, but the power of the powerless is the greatest power to be yet seen in this present circumstance. A true peace movement in the interest of all mankind, in which peace and development are identical. And that's something that has been being discussed by the leaders of Russia and China. It needs to be discussed by the leaders of the United States, the NATO nations, and all other nations. So on behalf of the LaRouche Organization and the Manhattan Project, I want to thank you for being with us today. We'll see you next week.